Eric Kaufmann, welcome to The Next Generation.
Elliot, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You recently released a new set of data that shows trans identification is falling amongst young people. It went viral online. What's happening?
Well, it's really quite interesting. This is the first solid indication that we have of a significant decline in trans identification. Now, the data that I released was mainly around people who don't identify as male or female, so what's known as non-binary. So the share who don't say I'm male or female, but tick one of the other options, non-binary, questioning, etc. That share rose to a peak in 2022, 2023, which was maybe around, at least in the large-scale data, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which has an annual survey of more than 50,000. Their latest wave was almost 70,000 undergraduate students between more or less the ages of 18 to 22. That number peaked at around 7% in 2023 and has come down to under 4%. It's more or less halved in 2 years. We also have a number of other data sources. I've looked at a prep school, sort of an independent elite high school, which has a survey which actually captures, at least 3/4 of the student body. So we don't have a sampling issue in that survey. And it shows an even more extreme rise and fall trend, like a peak to 9% in 2023, and it's dropped to 3%. So it's fallen it's only a third of its level 2 years ago. Another survey, which is again from Brown University, the student newspaper, capturing as much as half the student body or the relevant student body, showing the same trend. So that's what I put out there. The other part of this too is, it's the trans issue. So trans identification amongst young university students has really dropped in the last 2 years. It's halved. We also see a big drop in what I'd call non-conforming sexual orientation. So queer, bisexual, questioning, and some of these other sexual orientations other than either straight or gay lesbian has also had this pattern of rise and fall. And I think there's actually quite a strong connection between these two things. It's all about gender and sexual nonconformity, and that's peaked in 2023, 2022, and it's really shifted downward in the last couple of years. So that is basically the top line out of the report at my center, which is called the Center for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. That really did, and it got retweeted by a number of big accounts, mainly on the right, and was picked up mainly by conservative outlets. Okay. And that started a whole ball rolling, which I'm sure we're going to get into.
Well, this has happened independent of political shifts and social media use. What do you see, first of all, as some of the guesses that people put out there that are wrong as to why this shift has happened?
Right. So I think just from the data, which is really reasonably rich, I think we can kind of rule out a couple of things. One is that, Gen Z are returning to religion. There's no increase in the data. The data that shows, by the way, this dramatic drop in trans identification and queer identification does not show any drop in the share that say I have no religion. So there's no real story in terms of a return to religion. There's also not a story in terms of a shift to the right politically. There's no change in this data set over this time period. And likewise, you could say woke attitudes, the belief that somebody who says Black Lives Matter is a hate group, someone who says trans is a mental illness, should they be allowed to speak on campus? That kind of a question, again, showing stability through this time period from 2020 to 2025. So we're not actually seeing the trend in political attitudes as the explanation for this decline in trans and queer. And I've seen this in other kinds of data. There's a real decoupling. Now, and I should be clear about this. Yes, trans and queer people are going to be massively more left-wing, massively more woke than, straight or people who identify as their birth sex.
Is there any data on how much more likely they are?
They are very, massively more likely to be very left-wing, and they are massively more likely on certain questions. So to favor shouting down speakers, to say that's fine, they're much more likely to be in that camp. So that is all true at the level of the individual. But in terms of what I'm interested in is change over time. So yes, it is the case that, trans and queer are much more likely to be very left-wing. But that doesn't mean, okay, so there's a difference here. That doesn't mean that the drop in trans and queer is because there was a drop in the share identifying as very left-wing. And this is a tricky thing to understand. So if the way to think about it is some, more, wealthier states in the United States are significantly more democratic, Massachusetts, California, and so on, than the poorer states, West Virginia. But at the level of the individual, a very wealthy individual is not more likely to be a Democrat than so you can sometimes get these different relationships if we're talking about the aggregate versus the individual. And it's what's called the ecological fallacy. It can work for place. So a wealthy state like California or Massachusetts might be more democratic, but a wealthy individual is not. The same way, certain time periods. So what I'm talking about here is 2025 is a lot less queer and trans a time period than 2023. But at the individual level, that relationship is, there's a different relationship at the end of it. A queer individual is going to be much more left-wing. Sorry, I should also say 2025 is not more left-wing a period for students than 2023. It is more or much less queer and trans a period than 2023. So you would expect at the level of individuals these relationships to hold, but they don't. So that's just a bit of very technical stuff. So I don't believe it's a political shift. I don't believe it's a religious shift that's accounting for this. Now, what have I found in the data? One is that mental illness, so saying you are anxious or depressed most or all of the time, and there is a somewhat depressingly high number who say that, that has been dropping in this data for the last 2 years. So 2023, you see a drop. I mean, they only started asking this question in 2023, so we only have the 2 years. But other data shows that there was this rise at the peak of the pandemic. 2021, mental health among young people was at its worst, and it's improved. The 2023 Centers for Disease Control data for this, which is a large high school survey in the U.S., which is kind of gold standard, and it shows a real drop-off, in mental health problems, 10, 12-point drop-off. So we have had a drop in mental health or mental illness. That's come down. And that does seem to explain part of what we're seeing on the trans and queer. So the mental health is improving, trans and queer identity is dropping, and it seems to be related to some degree to this improving mental health.
And how do you work that out? How do you work out that that's related?
So how do we work out that that's related? Well, there's a statistical way where you control, in this data, what you do is you say controlling for sexual orientation, what's happened to mental health, or vice versa. You say, the way to do it is saying, I'm going to predict the share of trans in this data set, 6 years, 50,000 a year, and I'm going to predict it, and I'm going to put in mental health in that predictive model, which of course mental health is highly correlated with being trans. Absolutely. So those people have worse mental health. But I'm controlling for that. And even when I put in mental health into a model predicting trans identification, year is still a significant predictor, even controlling for mental health. So it still shows that 2023 is the peak, 24, 5 have dropped. So those years matter quite apart from mental health of the individual. So even controlling for this drop in mental health, we still see that year matters independently of that. So that's telling us there's something about the time trend that's independent of the improving mental health. So that's kind of how we do this statistically. Now, what's much more difficult is to say whether it's improving mental health has caused a decline of trans or decline of trans has caused improving mental health. I actually think the evidence shows that both of these things are operating. But what I would caution against is the people who say, people are less trans, that's what's causing the improved mental health. That is not the full story. That's a part of the story. I would say it's probably less than half the story, even considerably less than half the story. So that's sort of where I am on this.
Something that fascinates me in this argument, and to take it into the mental health lane specifically, you look at data from Jonathan Haidt and the work of him in The Anxious Generation. One of the main objections there I often hear, especially when I'm just speaking to mates down the pub or family members, they go, okay, but are these things actually correlated? The decline in mental health and the creation of the Instagram algorithm in 2012 or the creation of the iPhone or whatever it may be. Are these things actually correlated in the sense that trans or social media or screens make us mentally worse off? Or is it that indirectly our perception of our mental health has differed and we're just more sensitive to the fact that life's tough and we want to put the label on it saying, yeah, actually, I am persistently anxious, when in reality, we're feeling the same way as before we were so sensitive to these labels?
Yes, so I think it is mostly what you say. It is mostly a mission creep in the meaning of a term like mental illness, where people are misdiagnosing, mislabeling themselves as mentally ill, whereas, in a previous generation, because of the mental health diagnostic manual, you would not be listed. You would not be diagnosed as mentally ill. You'd just be diagnosed as having a bad day or something. So I think the expansion of these categories, and there is a whole literature, Nick Haslam, the psychologist, talks about concept creep. So there has been in academia, things which wouldn't have been seen as bullying or as trauma or whatever, as abuse, now are included in that bucket. I think that's ideological because it has the moral force of being bullying or being trauma or abuse, which carries a sort of real moral punch to it. And so there was, I think, this temptation amongst kind of, let's call it left humanitarian-oriented scholars to expand the meaning of these categories. And that, of course, then filters into the youth population and the practitioner population. And so, yeah, I think Abigail Schreier is probably correct. Now, the question then is, of course, if you diagnose yourself as having a mental illness, does that then mean you ruminate and become more likely to genuinely work yourself up into a state of mental illness? I think that's possible too. And it's really difficult in this field where we can't actually see it biologically in your brain necessarily, as far as I'm aware, to know exactly what's going on. But I suspect if I were to say, there's been an expansion of categories. So, for example, among young people, you'll say a a large number will say I was emotionally or psychologically abused as a young person. Now, the share saying that is really astoundingly high, and that's connected to people saying they have mental health problems. Is that really true? Or is it really the case that younger people are abused more than people my age, where I'm very skeptical about that. So I think a lot of it comes from this expansion of categories. And there have been, experiments even where people are asked to look at faces and to say which ones are threatening, and the experimenters reduce the number of threatening faces, but the share that's categorized as threatening remains the same because people are now categorizing less threatening faces in the threatening box. So there's this degree to which people are kind of wired to, or if danger drops, if society's less dangerous, people are wired to just think it's actually as dangerous as it ever was when it really isn't. And there is a technical term for this, which is escaping my mind right now, where people tend to sort of maintain a view of threat, even when the threat's declining. I think a lot of that is what's going on, is that in fact, even if levels of emotional abuse and so on are declining, you would still get the same level being reported. So there's a kind of sensitization to things which would never have been considered to be mental illness now being considered to be.
Well, it's so intriguing thinking about this concept and this link between saying that you are something and then potentially becoming it. And we're in a world now where I think in the UK about 23% of the female adult population are on antidepressants. And I don't know if it was about half or less of Gen Zers said they were persistently feeling feelings of anxiousness and sadness. It's a sad state of affairs, right? And I think there is something in, if you feel a certain way, even if that's been programmed into you by an oversensitivity to that thing, you are still feeling it. It's your mental health. And you kind of almost psyop yourself into feeling the feelings people imposed on you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And this is one of the problems is we don't know. I mean, this is Schreier's point that to what extent has concept creep in psychotherapy actually created a lot more mental illness than would have been the case if they had stuck to pre-existing diagnostics and definitions. And if so, I'd say that field has a lot to answer for. I mean, they thought they were being humane and sensitive, and this is can only be a good thing. I mean, this is partly an ideological project that people have to understand. This is really the outworking of an ideology of humanitarianism, which run through psychotherapy created this humanistic psychotherapy trend in the early 60s. Carl Rogers was one of the founders of this. Always affirm what your patient is telling you. Never sort of say, well, is that really the case? Have you thought about, have you tried to be more resilient? That went out the window with this humanistic psychotherapy, and that then became all the rage in academia. And then what happens is we get into the 2010s with social media. These radical academics are now their ideas are entering into the mass media for the first time and entering the youth culture for the first time. So it's really, social media is kind of a gateway. So I think there's a lot of questioning of the height hypothesis around social media and smartphone use and whatever. I think actually a more plausible mechanism, and I don't think he's necessarily wrong, by the way, but I do think a more arguably important mechanism for some of these trends is that radical ideas that were already popular amongst academics, actually, but were sequestered on campus and in academic journals, in a popularized, vulgarized form, made their way into the media, into the New York Times, into blogs, and influenced the culture. And in that sense, social media really mattered because it conveyed these relatively wonky ideas, radical wonky ideas, and in a sort of pablum form, sent them into the mass population.
It was a catalyst for those ideas. It wasn't the origin of the bad ones.
No, it was not the origin. In fact, you can look at academic papers and academic abstracts and look at what they were talking about. And there was this gradual increase from the 80s through to the 2000s in talking about hurt and harm and trauma. All these things had increased substantially already in academic papers. And this was becoming the orthodoxy. And so, but it wasn't that way in the general public or the youth population. And it took social media to put the academics and journalists together. Also at a time, I should say, when a number of things were happening. I mean, one is that media itself was shifting to a clickbait model and away from a classified ads model. So the incentives were you want to be viral on social media, you want to drive the emotions, and so media becomes more partisan, more emotional, and so they're very much in the market for these kinds of ideas. And so there is just a conduit from academia to the mass media and social media. If you look at, for example, trends on Twitter and trends in the media based on keyword frequency searches, you see an explosion in starting in the early mid-2010s, all the stuff around LGBTQ, all of the mental illness stuff, and the woke stuff, white privilege, white supremacy, patriarchy, all of that stuff really floods up at the same time. A lot of this had been talked about already in academic papers. So academia was already big on, patriarchy, systemic racism, all of the critical race and gender stuff, but the media was not. The New York Times really did not talk about white supremacy and white privilege and patriarchy much at all prior to the mid-2010s, and then suddenly they do. And it's just, you look at the keyword stuff and it just explodes. So I'd just say in terms of the culture and in terms of politics, all of these things emerge at the same time. But what is really important to understand is very quickly, at the level of individuals, there's a decoupling between the politics, the sexuality, the mental health. These things now start to move in different orbits. They're still somewhat correlated, but they have a lot more independence. So at the individual level, trends in sexual orientation, trends in politics, trends in mental health are starting to move in separate directions. And that's one of the reasons why, if we come to this decline in trans, that doesn't it is not necessarily an indication of a major political or religious shift. And it's only partly an indication of a shift in mental health.
Well, I want us to get onto why that decoupling has happened.
Yeah.
But first of all, the obvious quote that comes to mind for me with the birth of social media is the whole Charlie Munger thing of show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. But you've put forward that these ideas, and frankly, bad ones, were already prominent beforehand within the niche academic circles. They hadn't infiltrated the public conscience yet. So I guess the next question is, could they have done so without social media?
My view is probably yes. It would have been maybe more gradual, but if you look at how media was changing, becoming more partisan, more emotional, there was a receptivity in mass media. Now, all it was going to take was to get the sort of, radical feminist, critical race and gender stuff off the camp, and also the sort of, call it humanistic psychotherapy, the sensitizing psychotherapy stuff from the campus into the media. I think the receptivity was there. Somebody would have made that link. I still think it would have happened, but it wouldn't have happened as quickly, as dramatically, perhaps, as it did. So I do think that the die was cast. This is one of the reasons I would argue this is fundamentally an ideological issue and not a technology issue. That, yes, the technology made it quicker, made it faster, but I don't believe the technology is the key here. I think the key is the metastasizing of an ideology, which Jonathan Haidt calls, these moral intuitions, which is care harm on the one hand. One of the moral foundations is, protect people from harm, including psychological harm. That's like number one. Number two is equality of outcome. So those two beliefs, not as they apply to class or income, but as they apply to race, gender, and sexuality, had been germinating and expanding, and the logic of those things had been unfolding within the academy for decades. And I think it was only a question of time before these things just burst the blood-brain barrier between academia and media. Because ultimately we're going to have to reckon with these ideological trends which stem from academics and intellectuals. And in some ways, we're living through the outworking of the logic of their ideas of the care, harm, equality, moral intuitions in the culture. And in a way, peak woke was a bit of that, where those ideas, they were taken up with gusto by elites and intellectuals and by young people via their influencers in the pop culture. That surged. And now the problems with those ideas and the ridiculous, the absurdities of those ideas are coming home to roost, and now we're reckoning with them. So yeah, I think this is primarily cultural and ideological and not about technology.
We're going to have to unpack that more because you're blowing my brain here as someone who always lambasts social media and sort of puts that at the root of all our problems.
Yes.
And even as someone that has engaged with Jonathan Haidt's work, and he's written about, I think it's called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail, how we're all sort of intuitively working our way through the world, and we think that our moral judgments are based off of taking the data, analyzing it, and going, oh, that's wrong based on this, and this reason. Whereas actually it's the reverse. It's that we have these visceral, emotional, intuitionist judgments, and we map on the logic after the fact. I was reading that and I was going, social media is the perfect place to weaponize this and spread it en masse. But it seems that, and he would have written this before social media really took off, that was the case already beforehand. It just didn't have the vehicle, as you said, to spread wider in society. So break this down for me a bit further, the difference between the technological struggles that we're currently holding and the ideological ones that run deeper and older in time.
So the first thing I would say is let's look at the phenomenon of woke, for example, and I'll define that here quickly as I do in a sentence, which is really the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That is woke, from which comes, if you offend the most hypothetically sensitive member of one of these groups, you must be excommunicated, canceled. That is sort of what woke is. Now, let's look at the key sacred categories: race, gender, sexual orientation. Those were the key sacred categories when I was going to university during the era of political correctness in the late 80s, early 90s. It was race, it was sex in the sense of women, and it was also to some degree about LGBT. At that time, it was gay and lesbian more than trans. But those categories were the same back in what I would call the second awakening, and I would say this 2010s, 20s is the third awakening. Let's go back to the first awakening in the late 1960s. Okay, we didn't have as much on the sexuality, but we had race and sex. So you had radical feminism, you had the Black Panthers and critical legal studies in the origins of critical race theory. Race was an absolutely key category for the new left of the late 60s. So there's continuity in the last 60 years in the sacred categories of, in particular, race and sex, but sexuality already beginning, let's say, in the early 70s, but not as prominent in that first awakening, but certainly by the time I was going to university, racist, sexist, anti-gay, that was the chant of the left. And so these are already well established. All the speech codes that were coming into place in universities at that time in the 80s and 90s were based around these categories. And so there's a lot of continuity ideologically. If you look at the questions, and what I would say is, you look at social media, a lot of stories there are cycled in from the media. If the media didn't go for this stuff, the peer-to-peer stuff on its own, without validation from the media, I just don't think it would have gone in the same direction. I think this kind of needed elites in the media to come on board and to say, if you want to be really cool and modern and have the most virtuous opinions, these are the opinions to have. And there's a whole intellectual backing to it. So I think this is an intellectual movement which swept through, the New York Times. These are established institutions. It swept through the mainstream established institutions, mainstream universities. This is not just some fringe youth peer-to-peer phenomena. So my view on this is, social media may be a delivery device. It might have accelerated it, but ultimately it would have happened anyway, in my view.
Looking at this data, back to the polls here, non-binary dropped from 9% to 2% in 2 years. Is it fair to say that non-binary is basically just a fad that's going out of existence?
Yeah, I think that there was a huge element of fashion to this, and that in fact, so I'm decoupling it from, shifts to the right, even mental illness, that these are not really, or to religion. I don't think this is really what's behind it. I think this is quite an independent dynamic, and that's risen and fallen, and it looks like a fashion. The way a fashion would behave, a certain kind of running shoe, a certain kind of, it's kind of had an increase and a drop. Now, of course, maybe at the beginning there were political and mental health drivers of this, but right now I'd say it's relatively independent and it's declined a lot. The fact that queer and questioning and other kind of sexual orientations that are non-conforming have also dropped at the same time, I just think there is a shift back to more conventional, more conforming gender and sexuality in Gen Z. I mean, that is the way it looks. I should also say, by the way, there is and Jean Twenge, who's done a piece following mine, sort of confirming the results, but did some interesting generational analysis, which I did as well, which does suggest there is, in part, a generational component. So the youngest Gen Z, or maybe they're Gen Alpha, I don't know, are less likely to be trans and queer than the older members of Gen Z. And so there's partly a generational replacement effect. There's also partly what's called a period effect. So anyone of any age is affected by these shifts. I think both things are going on. But yeah, I think it's a fashion. I think it's decline. Now, of course, that the opposite explanation, which is only now surfacing among people who say, okay, when they first said, oh no, this isn't real, this is just his methodology was wrong. Now that Jean Twenge has weighed in, and they're kind of like, okay, well, yeah, it's happening, but the reason it's happening is because of Trump and the climate of fear around, trans and all this sort of stuff. So that is their their counter-explanation.
Do you think that could be a valid one? What do you think are some of the problems that could be there with the research?
So yeah, my view is that that's not the explanation, and I think there's a number of reasons why I would say that. I mean, I looked at survey data from the most progressive places you can imagine. You know, Ivy League universities, Brown, which is about, even within the Ivy League, would be, pretty much the most progressive, even of the Ivy League. Andover Phillips Academy, extremely woke private school. Now, I'm looking at these places. You could not imagine a place that is more tolerant of trans and queer than these places. And there we're seeing this drop. So we're seeing the drop in even the most incredibly tolerant places. If you look at a question like, do you self-censor your opinions? That is much higher amongst conservatives and Jews than it is amongst other students. It is not higher amongst, trans and queer students compared to other students, really. I mean, so they're not really feeling that they've got to shut their mouths and they got to be in the closet. So I'm really skeptical that that's playing much of a role. What Trump does, I mean, in a way, what Trump does almost fires the students up against him. You'd almost be more popular if you were going in the face of Trump than if you were going along with him. So yeah, I think this is really not a serious explanation.
We've kind of skirted around the edges of this, but
yeah.
Clearly, generationally, we are different as Gen Z. And this was all going on beforehand, before Gen Z, before the iPhone. But stuff's very different now. So can we go into that a bit deeper? The bigger differences generationally here with these woke causes and what you see as the trajectory.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And the first thing, I must preface this by saying that it is incredibly hard to poll young people in particularly the 18 to 24 age group, especially if they're not in university. They are very slippery to poll, and so there's a lot of noise in the data. So that's the first thing I want to say. And just to give you an example of this, if on most surveys up until recently, the sort of share of Gen Z who identify as not heterosexual is typically 25 to 30%, thereabouts. In the census data, one in Canada, one in Britain, where we've been able to get at this question, the share who select that option on the census is only a third as high as we're finding on the surveys. So given that the census is much more reliable, and we see this also politically, exit polls where you're getting people coming out of polling booths show Gen Z to be more conservative than polling does. And to the extent, therefore, that the Gen Z people who actually answer a poll are more interested in politics, more open to experience, which is a kind of personality trait, that could be skewing the data in this kind of progressive direction for Gen Z. So I'm always a little bit cautious, but let's just look at some broader trends. I would say, in my view, there's no question that Gen Z in a lot of the polling is less pro-free speech and more pro-emotional safety than other generations. And now, how would I back that up? There have been studies where they asked the same question in 2000 and in 2016 at Smith College, which is a liberal arts college. They asked about free speech questions in 2000 and in 2016, exact same questions, and we see a big drop in the support for free speech in the same age, 18 to 22. It's just 16 years later. Other surveys, again from the U.S., which is the best data, if you look at questions around should you allow a racist to speak in public to teach? There are other questions. Should we allow a homosexual, a militarist, a socialist, etc.? But of these questions, the one about a racist really does stand out from the other 5 categories. And that really moves in a direction of not allowing such people to speak. And young people are less tolerant of that. Other surveys have found, young people are more likely to say there's absolute right or wrong now. Whereas when I was, at university, young people were more likely to say, well, values are relative and there's neither good nor bad. There's been a shift to this very more absolutist type of morality. Okay, so that's kind of some basic trends. Less likely to be pro-free speech. I think that's real, and I think that is a feature of Gen Z. Now, this is particularly note if you are conservative, if you are a Gen Z conservative, then you're not as likely to be, you're more pro-free speech. And there's not as much difference between a boomer conservative and a Gen Z conservative on that. The big difference is the boomer leftist and the Gen Z leftist is a big, big difference. So what it means to be on the left has shifted. And to the extent a Gen Z person identifies as on the left, they're pretty intolerant of speech. So I think that is a real thing, and I do think it's generational and it's stamped so that, we know that people's brains stop growing in their early 20s. We know that many things like musical taste crystallize in the early 20s. So I would expect there to be a lot of persistence in these views. That's not to say they're etched in stone. There can be sudden changes. So even boomers change their views on gay marriage and things when the culture shifted. So it's not impossible you get a shift. I do, however, think that by the time the boomers are the median voter and institutional leader, we're going to have less tolerance for free speech just for generational replacement reasons. So I think that is something that's real, and I think it's a crisis, and I think it needs a lot more attention. But of course, it's not the whole story. So there is also another thing that has been noticed just in the last few years, which is that actually Gen Z are the most polarized on culture war issues. Yes, they are more woke, but they're also more polarized than other generations. So there's now quite a strong anti-woke element in Gen Z. And it is more male than female, but it's not just male. And that seems to have developed. And so actually what we see in a lot of countries is the young people are they're both voting for the populist right and for the Green Party more than established parties.
And you see it last year in the general election here in the UK.
Right.
The majority of men and women, 16 to 24, I think it was, they voted for Labour. There was a 2% difference, 42% for women and 40% for men. The real heart of this divide that you're speaking about is on the fringes. It's reform, it's green. It's not in the silent majority.
Right.
Talk to me more about that.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the populist right and green vote, or let's say the left extreme and the right extreme, are going to be greater amongst Gen Z than amongst other generations. So that seems to be there in every country. If you're Gen Z and you're on the right, you're voting reform, you're not voting Tory. Much more so than if you are a boomer and you're on the right. You're much more likely to be a Tory. This is not a new finding, I should say. First of all, young people are always more rebellious against the established, authority. And it's worth saying that for the populist right, another established finding is that men are something like twice as likely to vote populist right as women, even controlling for everything else across countries. Wow. So that is a established finding because women are partly more likely to uphold the established moral order. And whatever you're supposed to conform to that's prestigious, they will uphold that much more than men will. Men will be much more non-conforming. But even given all that, of course it's different by different countries. Britain's young people are the most left-leaning, actually. I'm from Canada. The Canadian young people are no more left-leaning than the older people. Whereas in Britain, there's a massive generational difference. U.S. is somewhere in the middle. Europe is somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's more like Canada a little bit. So there's quite a large young populist right vote in continental Europe, much larger than here, for example. So there is something here, and I'm happy to talk about why Britain is maybe a bit different. So I think the way this looks is that we're just going to see more polarization amongst Gen Z. And I suspect that as they get older, they will bring that kind of anti-establishment polarization. So they're going to be more towards the Greens and towards reform. That, I suspect, will happen more and more as we move.
You think they'll uphold it?
I think so, yeah. I think that they will alter the political map so that and we're already seeing this fragmentation. It depends on the country and it depends on a number of things, but the willingness to break with traditional party labels and to move to alternatives, to express their views, the volatility, I think there's going to be more volatility. They're just not as moored. They're not members of their local labor club and conservative club. They are willing to change their vote. Well, are they willing? They're willing to change their vote within ideological blocks. And so I just think we're going to see more of this fragmentation and volatility. in the electorate as a whole as Gen Z becomes the median voter. That would be my prediction.
Well, I wonder how much of that is, one, due to the incompetence of current parties on both sides. I just had Charlie Downs in that seat, and he describes Labour and the Tories as one side of the same coin, or two sides of the same coin. And I think that's true. Both sides have shown that they're incompetent in the UK. I feel that. I feel politically homeless as a 20-year-old that can vote in this country. I also wonder if it's perhaps something deeper than that and more cultural than political. This skepticism towards institutions as a whole, including the church, even when people are less atheist than ever, they're not more religious. They're more floating in between, spiritual but not religious. And to take it into politics, I wonder if amongst this individualism that we have present, we're just happier to sort of tailor-make our parties to fit our best interests. And we don't really care about going, yeah, but my whole family's Labour or my whole family's Conservative. It's me, what's personally best and fits exactly how I want the world to be. Could that be playing into this too?
Yeah. And I think what you're describing is the kind of individualism, which I think this Gen Z exemplifies, although I will say that trend's been going on for a long time. This individualism trend has been going on. Like it started, or people were talking about, so many people are living alone in Manhattan in the 1980s. So this has been going on for 60 years, these trends. It started with the rise in divorce, sex before marriage, then it's like single living, and now we are having alternative genders. And so I think this has been going on for a long time, and Gen Z simply represents a more extreme endpoint of this individualism, and so they will be even less moored to tradition and party than my generation, Gen X, was. We were already more unmoored than the boomers were, and they were more unmoored than silence. So it is a continuation of this pattern of expressive individualism that was already being noted even in the 60s, but especially in books like, Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind and in the 80s. And so you're right. So it's an individualism. I will pick and mix my religion. I'll pick and mix my political party. I'm not a member of my local labor club, my local church, my local union. So I'm much more detached. Part of that detachment, of course, involves lower trust in institutions, in the media, and young people are the least trusting of all the generations. But that's been going on for a long time. I mean, I would say this book, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, there's a whole literature on what's called social capital. How often do you go to dinner with your neighbors? If you bowl, do you bowl alone or do you bowl in a league? The more, what Putnam was noticing was bowling leagues were in decline, but bowling was not. People were not members of associations like the Freemasons. They were writing checks to causes they support. So they'll click on a cause and donate, but they won't be at a board meeting for their association going once a month. What that means, of course, is as a group, younger people are less connected. I mean, this is, again, the extreme endpoint of a trend that's been going on for 60 years. Putnam argues television was the beginning of this, that it detached people from socializing. The internet and social media are even more extreme examples of this longer-running phenomenon. So, yeah, I think you have a low-trust, very individualized, atomized generation. But I want to stress that my generation was also very individualized and atomized. So it's just a little bit further along the same path. And that's where modern societies have been moving for 60 years. And so all of the trends, which were already picked up for earlier generations, are just more extreme, I think, for Gen Z.
I really want us to unpack this ideological side and then the technological side, because what you've just outlined there, that seems explicitly technological, the television, the development of all these different mediums of communication. So let's get this crystal clear here. What are the key elements that are ideological, and what parts do you think are actually novel for Gen Z? What are we facing that's new? Because at the moment, I feel like a bit of a victim here, sort of going, we have it so uniquely tough when we haven't, and these trends have been developing for decades, like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's very important, I think, my view is that technology can accelerate these trends. even if you go back to the television, so there is a social isolation that is bred by, it's bred by general affluence too. And if you can afford to have your own place apart from your parents or your extended family, that's a kind of technology too. Wealth is allowing you to separate and have your own place, and you can live alone because you maybe get government support, government health care, and maybe you have your own money. You can get leisure outside the church. You don't need to go to church to have socialization. So there's a whole bunch of technologies that allowed for greater individualism. I think that the television was one of those. I think the internet and social media are also, so they do accelerate the process. I mean, the printing press, it was argued that was a source of individualism. Everyone could read the Bible for themselves. They didn't have to take the interpretation from the priest. Yeah. That was the origin of the Reformation. Okay, so, these things matter. Undoubtedly, they matter. I still am more of a culturalist. I believe that the outworking of the logic of ideas ultimately is more important. I think if you introduced social media in Afghanistan or in a culture that was much more conservative, I just don't think it would have the same effects as we see here. And you can in fact see that East Asia hasn't had the same mental health. They don't have the same trajectory around woke and mental health that we see in the West, even though they've got social media and they've got smartphones. So what is it about that culture? The culture is essentially one of expressive individualism is very important. So you should not listen to tradition. You should, reject tradition and make your own life. That's sort of one core element. And there's a whole literature on this. Christopher Lasch, Robert Bellah, there's a whole bunch of people who've written on this. The other part of it is, looking at your own feelings and analyzing your own feelings a lot of the time focusing on myself. That is part of this mentality as well. So the rise of the therapy culture is part of this individualism. So that's one strand of modern, particularly post-1960s, although again, we can trace this back even into the 19th century with bohemian intellectuals were doing a lot of these same things. But it took a long time for that to be coming into the mass of the population. That's a kind of older trend. But then the other one is these more what I would call leftist trends around the care, harm, and equal outcomes. We can't have any race gaps, any sex gaps in the boardroom, in admissions to Harvard. And this mentality comes more from a shift of the left away from Marxism and social class to race, sex, sexual orientation. That happens in the 60s. That's a sort of independent ideological development. And I think that's percolated into the mentality of a large chunk of Gen Z, starting with academia, moving into mainstream media, moving through to pop culture, into the youth culture. And now that's influenced them. So I would say this is a long-standing cultural development. Cultures, it's like DNA over your lifetime. It'll express itself over your lifetime. Likewise, cultures, they're like programs that have to unfold, and the implications aren't always obvious at the beginning. As they unfold, the more radical they're always taking it to the next level. We did gay, now we're going to do trans. We did psychotherapy. Now we're going to do, ADHD and whatever it is. So they're always moving it to the next level. They keep it fresh, and that's how you see the ideology unfold. And so now we're seeing the very radical implications of these ideologies and the pathologies which might have been concealed by, there was enough legacy interest in having two kids and having a family. Gradually, some of those legacy vestigial beliefs decay enough that you start to see, this is really what happens when you institutionalize maximal expressive individualism. This is where it goes. And so we're starting to see more of the pathologies and fewer of the benefits. And the balance between these two things is now shifted to the point, I think, that the culture is actually entering. The progressives had it all their own way for 60 years. All the attitude trends went their way. And now all of a sudden, just in the last 2 years, we've lost on gender ideology. Actually, the public opinion has shifted against the idea of natal men in women's sports and women's bathrooms just in the last 2 years. That's the first proper loss that the cultural left has recorded in 60 years of attitude trends. I think something important is changing.
There are so many questions, and I want to ask you a couple of big ones here that will be horrible to answer, so I'm sorry. But that's terrifying. The idea of these ideologies getting implemented and they're compassionate and they reduce harm and they're all good for us. And then 60 years down the line, they poison our societies from within. How do you avoid that? How do you smell the carbon monoxide gas that you physically can't taste before it's too late? I mean, the thing that terrifies me that we speak about all the time on the show is the fertility crisis that's unfolding. And Stephen J. Shaw's research on this is phenomenal. And he was in that seat a couple of months ago. Right. And the trouble is, it's kind of wrapped up in all of these very compassionate and genuinely good progressive ideas. The liberation of women entering the workplace and therefore having long and illustrious careers, prioritizing those rather than family. It's so hard to untangle all of these different problems without opening up new ones or returning to a genuinely oppressive past. So, first of all, how do we smell the carbon monoxide gas early on? And second of all, if we're already in a position where it's about to kill us, right, how do we go about tackling that?
Yeah, these are really good points. And I think you put your finger on it, that a lot of these cultural trends are things that were good in the beginning and did a lot of good, but have a falling, diminishing return, and where the negatives outweigh the positives. And that's always very difficult because someone who's arguing in favor of, let's say, gender ideology will always go back to the past when there was intolerance. People didn't tolerate gays and blacks and now they're doing the same with trans. So they'll always try and legitimate the next step by drawing on the cultural capital of the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and things where you really did have, prejudice against gay people. You couldn't be gay, right? So they were right back then. But now they're wrong. And that's really always a hard argument because they'll just say, no, you're just like the people who are against gay rights. You're against trans rights. And it's very hard to say, well, there's an optimum here, right? You've gone too far. Now, in some cases, we have been able, things that are less sacred, like crime. Now, crime does touch on race in the U.S., for example, but there was a soft on crime trend, in the sort of 70s and 80s. And that was to some degree reversed with, and people came to see that that wasn't a good idea, that we have to do something about the crack cocaine epidemic and what it's, the damage it's doing to black neighborhoods. And a lot of black politicians very much wanted this crackdown. So we have had these things go up and down in the past. However, I think it's a little tougher with anything that is purely cultural where it's not having a very clear material effect. Now, if it is destroying neighborhoods, so now we've seen, this idea of safe supply, give the addicts the drugs they want. That, because it's essentially destroyed a lot of lives, very clear it doesn't work. Yeah. Something concrete like that, it doesn't touch on race, gender, sexuality. Okay, we can give on that. Progressives can give on that without really touching the core sacred values as much. But to actually back off on, for example, our past it's a systemically racist, patriarchal society. It's not obvious that those policies, I think they are doing a lot of concrete damage, but it's not as in your face as, as crime and drugs. So they don't have to back off on it as much. So I do think that one question will be, so if you look at trans, for example, I think the evidence is pretty good that it's damaged a lot of lives. However, we're talking about a small number of people. There's still some dispute over exactly how extensive the damage is and how much is it a social contagion versus not. And so they're still digging in. They're still not willing to give up. Like if you look at the Democrats in the U.S., they still don't want to give up the trans activist position and say, yeah, sex is kind of biological and binary. And it's just very hard because this is a kind of belief system where it's like almost like a religion, like history's moving towards justice. We are on the right side of history. History is, the progressive agenda is about being nicer to people who are less fortunate and having equality between the fortunate and the unfortunate. We just have to have those two, the care, harm, and equality moral foundations that Haidt talks about. We just have to click into those intuitions and push down the gas pedal and go forward. And we're on the right side of history. Of course, the negatives of that are showing up. People are expressing skepticism, but people on the progressive left are so emotionally invested in this care, harm, equality narrative around the race, gender, sexuality. I just think for them to back off on any one strand, it's like riding a bike. If you stop pedaling, you're going to fall over. And I just think it's just impossible. I think for the true believers, they cannot back off on any of these things. The narrative is just one more push, and it'll be like civil rights and gay rights. We're on the right side of history. This is a setback, but we just have to keep going. To actually concede to the other side would be to unravel, to pull all the strings apart on this ball of twine, and I just don't think it's going to work.
It's this kind of chronic, toxically empathetic addiction that just shoves us down the wrong path. I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts on this rise in Gen Z men specifically going back to church and converting to Christianity. What do you make to that rise in the last decade?
Well, again, this is quite disputed, and I mean, there was one survey which showed it, and I think we're going to need more data. I don't want to go out on a limb and say there definitely is a religious revival. I think the poll is strong data. It's contradicted by other data. I think I really would have to say I want to wait and see on this before I confirm that that's a trend.
So the data from 4% in 2018 to 21%, Bible Society report.
Yes.
I saw this. I'm no statistician, but I thought this is complete bullshit.
Right.
That was my intuition.
And I think that's a good and healthy intuition, and it is one survey, and it's contradicted by other surveys. Until all the surveys are moving the same way. So on this trans decline, we have a whole bunch of surveys saying the same thing. Until that's the case on religion, I am hesitant to say this is happening. I think it's plausible, but I'm hesitant. I mean, similarly, I would say on woke attitudes, there's some quite strong survey evidence in the U.S. that has shown a decline in, the share of young women saying that they are liberal, which in the U.S. is basically left, has gone down 15 points in the last 2 years in quite a large student survey. It has not gone down in the FIRE, which is a very large student survey. So we now have two separate data. Now, it's true that the HERI college data, it polls students at all institutions down to very low-ranked institutions. And so is it picking up people who are less elite? And is the trend, the shift to the right more amongst people who are less elite? That's certainly what the data kind of seems to show, like the non-university, less elite population of young people are the ones who seem to be the ones who've moved right. And maybe that's the trend, whereas the elite young people are continuing to be woke and they're continuing to support the left. That could be the pattern. So with a lot of these things, until we see confirmatory survey responses. So on the religion one, I think it's just too early to say.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that there would be a rise. I don't know about 4%. 6 years ago to 21%.
Right.
There was one theory that posited that the data was actually wrong at the start, and that it was a higher percentage initially. So it increased less, but it was still that prominent. It does make sense to me, though, with young men feeling increasingly disenfranchised and sort of just checking out of the game completely. Of course, more and more, especially young guys who feel demonized by this recent liberal mutation, they're going to go more conservative, like the data shows. And I think tied to that, they're going to go more religious because they want something everlasting. They want something that just transcends themselves and actually connects to something higher. And I struggle with this because I'm not religious. I'm kind of agnostic. I have a lot of Christians on the show and I talk to them because I'm very interested in their worldview and whether it's true or not. And that's because I feel like that's what I need in today's world. I'm struggling to find bedrock.
Right.
It's nowhere to be seen. Everything's subjective. Everything's emotional. And I don't like that. And I don't like that the logical conclusions of a lot of the worldviews I actually hold lead me down dark paths that clearly don't work for society, or at least haven't in recent times. So I just wonder what's next for young men.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many good questions there. And I think what is next? I mean, one thing I will say, I did an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal on this theme of post-progressivism. So what if, the progressive era is starts in 1964, 65, and goes to the early 2020s. And what if that's an era in the culture that's over? Right. So I think there's some indications of this, that we might be entering into a new dispensation, a new, what I call post-progressive era. And I use, for example, a number of data sources. I mean, one is, the shift against transactivist positions on women or biological males in women's sports. That's concrete, is real, it is dramatic, and it is the first real enduring loss that the cultural progressives have had in public opinion in 60 years, I would argue. I know there are a few blips around crime and a few, but I think it's very important. I also think that, the fact that Trump gets elected, when Trump got elected in 2016, and you had millions marching around and you had this, explosion of resistance. He then gets elected in 2024 and the resistance is just muted. So the cultural left really has lost a lot of its emotional punch. I think that's telling us something. Left-wing cancellations, way down. The mainstream media talking about white supremacy and white privilege and patriarchy and all these things, way down. There are a number of indications that I think that serious leftists, and people like, Matthew Iglesias and Noah Smith and even Ezra Klein, and some of these people are saying, look, if the progressive utopia is the West Coast cities, the Seattles and San Francisco, that's not a really good advertisement for civilization. It's kind of, I think there is at the elite level, serious thinking people on the left, particularly the center left, I think are questioning a lot of things they didn't question before. Whereas they just were in this right side of history mentality. History's moving inevitably in this more cultural progressive direction. I think that's now being questioned by the serious people. Not just because they lost the election, but all for other reasons.
Yeah, before the election. And you're saying the reaction's more muted, there are less left-wing cancellations, and you open up that can of worms of what it tells us.
Yeah.
What does it tell us?
Well, I think it tells us that their confidence, the activists' confidence, the movement's confidence has really been damaged. This idea that we're on the right side of history, we just have to push the pedal down because we have the right beliefs. The resistance will be overcome. They're just the reactionaries. I just think that mentality and worldview and historical consciousness has been damaged.
I think it's the boy who cried wolf as well. When you cry wolf too many times, people are going to stop listening. And then when something bad happens, they're not going to notice it. And this is the problem that's happened. I mean, you see it manifest in something like the assassination of Charlie Kirk, where for years, people have gone, you disagreeing with me, you saying your opinion openly, that's violence, right?
Right.
Hate speech, whatever it may be. Then you don't embrace Black Lives Matter, you don't post a black square on your Instagram, and they go, silence is violence.
Right.
And then finally it's like, oh, violence is violence. So it's this thing of the boy who cried wolf, and people, especially from the left initially, but I see anecdotally on the internet, the right doing this just as much now, throwing around these labels of communist, fascist, Nazi, far right, far left. What happens is you dilute the meaning to the point where the actual far right, the actual Nazis can slip through the cracks, right? So no wonder the left are more muted when they've been trying their games for years and they've failed. They've used up all of their cards. And I wonder if the same is going to be true for the right in a few years, if they're going to use up all of their trump cards too.
Nice pun there, by the way. Trump card. No, God, there's so much in that question. I mean, the first thing to say is I think there is obviously a populist anti-woke There's an anti-woke resistance online, and then there's also been populism. That is one kind of challenge. And so you have populist resistance to the establishment woke left narrative, progressive narrative. I don't think that was necessarily a fatal thing for the woke left narrative. They could just say, these people are the reactionaries and they don't know anything and they're just a bunch of idiots and they're moral reprobates and whatever, deplorables. Okay. However, when you lose election, a number of elections, then that induces, at least, again, in the thinking center leftists, why are we losing these elections? actually maybe the populists have a point on some things and not others. So I think that I would place and so yes, it's the case that the left has been calling people racists for decades and doing it successfully. People would run into the corner. That taboo was very powerful. I think some of that has worn off, partly due to the audacity of the populist right. A Trump figure was obviously pretty important. A Musk figure, clearly the right has been willing to challenge the left's cultural power, the power of these taboos, and has helped to erode them to some degree. I still think they have pickup in the elite institutions, actually. So they haven't completely lost their power. They still matter. But I guess what I'm talking about is more, let's just forget about the right for a minute and the populists and just look at the left. I just think the thinking people on the left are less confident. And the movement is less confident and splitting now between the double down true believers, the Democratic Socialists of America, and they're also controlling the Democratic Party in many ways. But then you have the center-left group who are actually much more open and calling out woke and saying this is a disaster. Our position on trans is a disaster. Questioning California can't build a train line anywhere. You can't build anything. You can't build houses. There are all these attics everywhere. This is clearly not where civilization needs to go. And so I actually think this is a deeper crisis for the left. I think it's an intellectual crisis. And one of the questions for young people is the elites that are now maybe going to help to redefine the left. We'll have to see what happens to the left. Who wins this factional fight between the moderates and the radicals? And will the woke left be marginalized by the sensible centrists is a question. And will that even percolate? There are even, believe it or not, some green shoots in academia. Like, the university presidents are obviously saying yes to political neutrality, no to mandatory diversity statements, no to being essentially political actors. And even amongst academics, I think there's been a slight shift. They're sort of saying, yeah, DEI wasn't a great idea. Getting all political maybe wasn't a great idea. Now, I'm not saying all academics, but there's a chunk of the center left. The chunk of the center has shifted against the woke agenda. I think that's very real. One of the questions is, my view is this is going to change the high elite culture. For so long now, the elite culture has been, you got to be on the left to be a good person. This is where history's going. I now think there is more questioning of that, and it's a very uncertain time of transition. And I think that will affect young people. And I don't exactly know how, but I think the message that young people have been getting, that woke is the way, this is the enlightened way, is the virtuous way, I think there's now more of a challenge to that in their ecosystem. So how are they going to reflect that? I don't know. I suspect it'll be reflected in a real polarization within young people going forward. Yeah.
Well, I want us to tie all of these ideas together now to wrap up. We've got a lot going on here with data and polls and intergenerational stuff. Let's take it back home to Gen Z here.
Right.
Where does the left go from here in Gen Z in the next few years? Where does the right go? And ultimately, what do you see as the future in the West for Gen Z?
Wow. Obviously there is variation between countries in what's going to happen. I think that Gen Z is going to be more divided politically around these cultural issues. I think the cultural issues are more important for the young left than the older left, and they're more important for the young right than the older right. So the boomer right was still the old Thatcher Reaganite right that focused a lot on, getting government out of the economy and so on. I think those concerns are less important. I think the young right is much more concerned about, preserving national identity, including the ethnic character, not ethno-nationalism, but saying, well, there's a majority, there's a minority. We want to maybe talk about that since there's rapid demographic shifting. We want to talk about birth rates, which you mentioned. We want to talk about these taboo topics around free speech, around our history, around sexuality. So I think that's more important for the right, and it's more important for the left. And that's one of the reasons. So the young left is really not focused that much on the older, economic life. I mean, that still matters, but it's not the main driver. And so I see the cultural, the process of moving from a politics of left-right economics to a politics of the globalist, nationalist, cultural issues. To put it in crude terms, that realignment of the key dividing lines in society, I think that process is going to continue, and that the Gen Z population is really going to reflect that more than any other generation. They're going to be voting on these issues, and they're going to be sorting on these issues. And I think that's not a bad thing in a way, because I do think these issues probably are the most important ones that need to be sorted out. I mean, on the economy, you don't have much wiggle room. You can't just, redistribute all your money, or the bond markets will attack your currency. You have very little room to move there. You can't, on the other hand, say we're not going to spend any money on the public services and let the NHS waiting times. So I think the economic questions are, if not settled, they're moving within a tight band. It's a technocratic set of issues. The cultural issues are much more positional. And those, I think, are actually the right issues to be debating politically. So I think actually Gen Z has that right. I think those issues we need to come to an accommodation on. And I think those are the right issues to be talking about. So that's, where I see Gen Z going, is just they're going to be voting and thinking in a more polarized way. There is no singular trend. Yes, they are on average going to be more woke, less pro-free speech, but on the other hand, they're going to be fighting about those issues quite a bit.
Is there anything else that concerns you? I mean, just listening to you speak today and kind of looking back at this cultural evolution that's happened so rapidly the last 100 years, let's say, it's unfolding at a much faster pace than biological evolution, obviously.
Yeah.
And this has been on my mind so much recently since speaking to David Pinsoff, who's a professor at UCLA, evolutionary psychologist. And he laid this out to me, this battle between evolution biologically and evolution culturally. And ultimately, he thinks that the biological evolution always wins that race. You get slapped in the face by the biological brick wall eventually.
Right.
And that's probably the biggest thing that I think about now is, what are these things that are noble and liberal and progressive that we embrace? They could be right-wing and we think they're noble too, and we hold them up so highly and hold them so dearly to ourselves. What are those things that are 60 years down the line going to screw us over? It's just terrifying how much stuff has changed so fast, not only with culture, but with technology that we've outlined today, speeding up that entire process, expediting it massively. I can just imagine there are so many things, not to get too pessimistic here, because I'm quite an optimistic person generally, but there's so much room for error here with the amount of change we've incurred on ourselves. Is there anything else that you kind of see going forwards that maybe isn't a problem, won't be for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but could open up down the line as a result of other things?
Wow. I think we can kind of spot the things that might be problems, and I'll try and tie this in, because we could talk about technology, and I'm not as much of a pessimist around things like AI. And even social media and smartphones, I would say there's actually quite a debate over whether, in fact, that is causing the mental health problem. So I don't think that's by any means a done deal. Even though I slightly lean to the Jonathan Haidt position, but I'm not sure. What I would say is, let's just deal with something that is also relevant to your point about evolution, which is birth rates and fertility rates. The fact that Gen Z appears, again, early days, we don't know, but it appears that their fertility rate, that is the number of children the average woman will have in her lifetime, is going to be very lower than in previous generations, well below the replacement level. We're seeing this trend around the world, and this then means, if we're talking about evolution is really about fertility rates in a way and survival. It's also about mortality, but mortality is not as much of an issue. We've got modern medicine and people live to the same rough ages, within a certain band. So we don't have a lot of young, babies dying, whatever. It's all about fertility differences. Who is going to be populating the planet in the future? If we're talking about evolution, now, on the one hand, what we know in developed countries is, if you are religious and you attend services weekly, you, roughly speaking, will have a replacement level fertility rate. If you say you don't have a religion and you don't go to church or services, roughly speaking, your fertility rate will be around 1.0. So a half child to a child, I think it's more like a child difference then between those two groups. And compounding means, more children, more mothers, more children, fewer mothers, fewer children. So you take these lines, it takes only a few generations for these trends to lead to quite rapid compositional shifts in the population. Now, I know that a lot of kids of religious people become secular. So the question is going to be, how quickly are the kids of religious people becoming secular versus the birth rate differential? And any weakening of the secularization trend of kids of religious people becoming secular is going to mean that the religious are going to take over faster. I would say, I'll give you a couple of examples of where the religious have taken over. One is Israel, where the ultra-Orthodox Jews have a birth rate of between 6 and 7 kids, which they've maintained. It's not in decline. The secular Jews, it's around 2. Because of that, and there's also the modern Orthodox who are in between. Because of that, Israel has become a much more religious and conservative society as a result of this. In other cases, the evangelicals in America, 3/4 of the growth of evangelical Protestants is because they had a one-child birth rate advantage over the mainline Protestants, kept it up for several generations. Now, you could imagine a situation in Western countries where if the religious become more conscious of themselves as a group and are not as likely to switch to become secular, then the religious will expand as a share of the total. You can see this already, and the Mormons are a larger share of the young population of white America, much larger than they are of the older. So one way this works out in evolutionary terms is we just become more religious as a population, as the non-religious die off out of this population bottleneck. Another way is, well, people who like kids and like families and like having kids biologically, who value that more than, let's say, pursuing a career that's very time-consuming, are eventually going to be Korea's population. So maybe Korea will shrink through this bottleneck and they'll fall to 100,000 people. I don't know how small they'll get.
Well, I think South Korea have a 96% extinction rate in the next 2 generations or something absurd because of the compounding effect. It's terrifying what's going on there.
Yes. So part of the thinking through this in evolutionary terms, the population shrinks to a hardcore of people who really like kids, and then those people reproduce, and then the population expands. But the genes that these people represent are the ones that survive the bottleneck. Now, well before we get there, of course, other problems. The problem with low birth rates is not only the low birth rates and the population decline, it is the political ramifications. So it shifts the composition of the population when some groups are shrinking and others are not. And so obviously Koreans ethnically are going to decline if they bring in immigrants. The immigrants are going to make up a larger share of the total, as they are here in other Western countries. And that shift in the composition causes political conflict, as we're seeing. Populism is really the outgrowth of shifts in ethnic composition. And so we're going to have a lot of political turmoil as a result of going through this bottleneck. It would be better if we could somehow turn around this declining fertility rate and get it back up to 2.1. The problem is it's much harder to increase fertility than to decrease it with government incentives. There have been some minor successes. I would say France has been worrying about their birth rate for 200 years, and it does seem like all of those government policies over this period has maybe made some impact.
Or the massive influx of Islam. That could just be the other solution.
Exactly. But look, I think, even in Arab Muslim countries, North Africa and South Arabia, there's been a lot of a decline in birth rate.
You see it in everywhere apart from sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, exactly. I think they will also decline once they get better educated, more money, more urbanized. But this is, again, something that academia should be taking the lead on. And yes, demographers do study fertility a lot. I will give them that. But policymakers and certainly a lot of the social sciences, they're not particularly interested because they think it's a feminist issue, and you don't want to, don't want to talk about anything traditional gender role because that's offensive to feminism. And so a lot of the left doesn't really want to talk about this in many countries.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it in that way before. I had a conversation about this, And I kind of just realized, if you don't like the current woke agenda, just have kids. Don't tell the woke people to have kids. They won't anyway because they're too busy pursuing their careers and getting educated. And at least your grandkids will live in a world where everyone's conservative and religious, if that's what you want. But the question is, what happens before that because of the massive shifts societally? Could it be the case that you get more old people, which you will, less younger people, and then suddenly, for some reason, the society actually shifts left and there's this massive diversion before you get to the conservative religious people that are the only ones still reproducing? I don't know. There's so much there. I don't know how much you have to say on this topic, and I hate to get people to extrapolate and make predictions, but what would you see happening and unfolding along this path to returning towards biological evolution, say the next 100, 200 years, where it does favor people that are religious, especially fundamentalists, they have the higher birth rates, and it does favor a more conservative worldview, both large C and small c, that people like myself perhaps don't want to see.
Yeah, and that is a risk, of course, is that we don't necessarily want fundamentalists. Well, we don't want fundamentalists to be in control of the society either. And in fact, in Israel, for example, Jerusalem is now run by the ultra-Orthodox, and you can't have a woman's face on a billboard within the city limits. You've got to be outside the city limits. You can't drive on Saturdays. So, yeah, I mean, that shouldn't be something, we don't want that either. But the issue is, of course, we can't have a situation of crashing birth rates where and so I think one way the left seems to be dealing with is to say, well, what we'll do is we will encourage immigration and we will ally ourselves with conservatives as long as they're not white and Christian. And so we'll ally ourselves with conservative Muslims and Hindus and others. And that will be our rainbow coalition. It'll be, the Queers for Palestine thing, where you kind of have, Islamists and LGBT or woke left in one tent against the mainstream ethnic majority conservatives. Now, of course, the problem with that strategy is it can easily break down. We saw in Detroit, for example, where this is in an area of Detroit which became majority Muslim or became Muslim run. The local government said, well, we're not doing pride parades anymore. We're not going to commemorate that anymore. And the sort of woke left came out and they said, how we've been supporting you and all of a sudden you're betraying us. We've seen this in Canada too, where the leader of the protests against gender ideology in schools was a Muslim allied with sort of white Christians. There was we've seen it on gay rights in California, Prop 8. Conservative Muslims were in with evangelical Christians opposing gay marriage. So I think that this is not a stable strategy for the left. But that's the strategy they're going to go with, is like we're going to sort of try and break off the non-white religious conservatives and put them into our tent and try and scare them into thinking they're going to be discriminated against, and so they must come in with us. I think it's a short-sighted strategy, and it's not something that's going to work long-term for them. But that's sort of one way you could see the politics evolving. Now, of course, long term, you might see you might actually see sort of secular right-wingers, at some point, if they really are worried about the fundamentalists taking over, then they may say, okay, we'll form an alliance with the left. So you could have all kinds of interesting new alliances forming as a result of these changes. Israel's an interesting place. Like, you will see secular nationalists sort of moving, saying, we've got to worry about these ultra-Orthodox. They don't serve in the military. They're economically not very productive. We got to crack down on them and stop giving them benefits. And so sometimes when the battle with the Palestinians is at a low ebb, this internal fracture line between these populations live totally apart. The fundamentalist Jews and the secular and even moderate Jews are living in quite separate lives. And they will raise the alarm and say, these guys, they're a third of their first grade class. They're going to be taking over. So I expect, you have these two different things. There's the Jew-Muslim thing. And then you have cutting across that, the Jew versus Jew. And you could imagine the Jew versus Jew becoming more important. And I think we're going to see these sorts of strange little cross-cutting tensions also in Western societies. Like, there could come a point where, people who support MAGA and some conservatives at some point way in the future, they say, actually, do I want this coalition of fundamentalists to take over my society and threaten my freedoms? Or do we form an alliance with the kind of cultural left? They may say, actually, we do form an alliance with the cultural left. So yeah, I think it will be a very interesting time, because really the big demographic replacement, if you like, if we want to use that term, is ethnic right now. White decline, in white majorities in decline. The next replacement is going to be seculars in being replaced by very religious people, cutting across race, cutting across ethnicity. And so it's a different politics that would emerge in that distant future. And just to give you a nice little demographic number, the U.S. in the mid to late 2200s, there will be 300 million Amish in America, because they have a doubling time of 25, 30 years. Their fertility rate remains pretty much what it was. So, and if you think that's fanciful, right? Well, Israel is undergoing this right now, where the ultra-Orthodox are a third of the Jewish first graders. They were maybe like a few percentage points in 1960. These things, they're going to be the majority of observant Jews in the U.S. and Britain. From again, a small minority, fringe minority, to the majority in a few generations. So that is, I think that kind of politics will be an interesting one to watch, but it's not going to be in Western countries for a century or two, because the way these trends work is there's nothing going on. It's like the parable of the rice grain on the chessboard. One rice grain, double it is 2, double it is 4. There's still basically nothing happening. And then suddenly when you double it, it goes like this, and then it's off the scale. So it's going to be dormant for a long time, in Western countries. And it's not going to be an issue that we're going to face until 100, 200 years from now. You do see it in small pockets, like in the countryside. Certain communities will suddenly be taken over by the Amish or ultra-Orthodox, and the whole town will go, what just happened? We just added an entire village, and they're now running the government here. So it's happening in isolated little points, but it's not national yet, and it won't be for quite a while.
Are you religious?
I am somewhat religious, but I'm not. I don't know. I'm not a member of any religion, and but I can see that it's probably, it has a lot of benefits for society, for individuals. So I think we're going to have to reckon more seriously with it than we have over the last 250, 300 years since the Enlightenment. I just think the challenge it poses to the Enlightenment worldview is much more profound now that the birth rate population collapse crisis is well and truly entrenched. I don't think it's one you can just brush aside anymore. And so I think there are going to be more and more compelling reasons to adopt parts of it. How much of it is going to be interesting. So I don't know.
Yeah, this makes me think there might be something to being Amish, looking at that data. I mean, I'm not religious, but certainly I look at what you're saying and what's unfolding, and I go, okay, either it's true, whatever religion you end up choosing, or certainly at very least, these are incredibly powerful fundamental frameworks that change entire societies and culture and history, like they have done throughout all of time, and we need to start taking them more seriously.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And this, I think, kind of links to my point about post-progressivism. I think that progressive era was really maybe the last final expression and outworking of Enlightenment trends reaching a sort of fever pitch. But I don't think we're going to be there anymore. I think from now on, it's now about, the left will be playing defense. The liberal left will be playing defense. And it'll all be about, okay, how much of the conservatism do we need to bring back in? And where do we compromise and where do we not? And we're going to have to actually wind things back not in exactly the same way, but this idea that history is moving in this linear direction and we're on the right side of it. I just think that confidence is increasingly going to fall apart. And so things will be much more fluid and up for grabs in a way they really haven't been through the Enlightenment. I know there's been a lot of ups and downs and whatever, but I just think that confidence is going to be shaken by these trends. Now, I will raise another possibility, and that is the authoritarian possibility. Like, what will China do with its 1.0 or 1.2 birth rate? You could imagine a powerful enough, authoritarian enough state saying, what we're going to do is we're going to make it so difficult for you to exist without having kids. We're almost going to force the birth rate up to a replacement level. So if you don't have children and you will essentially be punished in so many different ways. Or at least your life will be so miserable.
What would that look like?
Well, it might look like, huge taxes. You have no access to services. Maybe you are, even shamed in certain ways. I don't know what the Chinese government would do. I also think they can certainly clamp down on the growth of religious fundamentalism too. So they can go in both directions because they're authoritarian. So I think the outcome of it's going to be interesting to watch where China goes as a sort of laboratory of the authoritarian world. It's one I think is horrendous, but I mean, that is another evolutionary strategy. Is the state is simply authoritarian and regulates fertility and population in a way that the West cannot. Whether that'll work, I have no idea. But that's just another wild card to think about.
And what does a world look like then when you have evolution selecting on one hand for religious fundamentalists and on the other hand for communist authoritarian states to keep the birth rate above replenishment?
Well, I'd say look at what is Israel going to do about its mushrooming ultra-Orthodox population that's, according to some predictions, is going to essentially make the country insolvent, crash the welfare state in a decade. The Israeli central banker has made that statement that if we don't do something about this, our birth rate's going to, the budget is going to fail. We won't have a welfare state. And once you get the relatively secular moderate Israelis leaving, all of the tech sector and all the dynamic aspects of the Israeli economy will unravel. You won't have a tax base. So there is a scenario under which Israel collapses because of the fundamentalist birth rate. So one way is to say, well, what's Israel going to do about this problem? And many are in denial, or they like to think, well, their birth rate's coming down, or they're assimilating into the mainstream. But I think those are all very weak trends. So watch China, watch Israel to say, what is the next solution going to be? They kind of define two extremes. The West, I think, is a little different. We have the cultural progressivism and the wokeness, which is contributing to falling birth rates here. It's not a factor so much in East Asia, but it is in the West. I think the West, what we'll see is more soul searching, and we're going to see more questioning of this narrative of cultural progressivism. I can't see any other way around it. Their model isn't working in so many ways. And I think the smart ones amongst them know it, which is one reason why, look at the universities under attack by Trump. There's resistance, but it's nothing like they're not fighting to preserve DEI. They're more or less saying, we're going to fold that one. I think that's indicative of the fact that a lot of them, they're fighting amongst themselves. There's a group who thinks the woke thing was a terrible idea and we got to get rid of it. And another group that's like, no, this is religion and we got to have it. So in many ways, I think we're going to see really interesting stuff in the next 10 years. I think I would more confidently predict that the cultural progressive trajectory of the last 60 years is done. I'm quite confident that that's finished. I'm not saying we're going to suddenly lurch in the other direction, but I think the further progress, I don't think trans is ever going to be accepted in public opinion. This access to women's spaces thing, I just think that's the Waterloo of this ideological movement.
So to put all of these clickbaity titles together that have been going on for the last decade now, is this the end of woke? The death of wokeness? Blah, blah, blah. Is this past peak woke now? Is that where we're at?
Yes, we are past peak woke. Now, let me just put in a few, I don't dispute that. So what I'd say is in the high elite culture, we're past peak woke. in terms of the movement activism, we're past peak woke. But it is true that woke managed to, call it brainwash, call it socialize, a much larger share of Gen Z than other generations, more of the millennials as well. And they are going to have to work their way through the electorate. And so there is going to be some generational turnover, cohort change effect. So a certain, what's the word? A certain woke momentum will move through the electorate, even as the merit or at least even if the idea has lost currency.
Well, I suppose it's like a roller coaster where you've got the momentum that's been powered up the hill.
Right.
It's stopped, yet the momentum's still there, and it kind of carries the roller coaster along for a bit further until it eventually drops rapidly.
Yes. And so that's why I think there will be some momentum from past socialization moving through the population. Now, that's not 100% set in stone in the sense that if the culture really turns against something, the way they accepted gay marriage, if that is a big cultural shift, it will overcome and override the generational effect and the momentum. And so that is a possibility, is that the culture changes so dramatically that despite that generational socialization, all of that is knocked off course. And so I think, but regardless, I just think in terms of what's most important, which is the esteem and the confidence of these ideas, I think that's been dented irreparably. And so I just think that's very important. How that plays out, because the other thing, of course, is woke has become institutionalized as DEI in the NHS and universities and civil service. That will carry on as a zombie force. Even if the culture changes, the only way that gets removed is through government action, as we're seeing in the U.S. So in Britain, for example, if reform got in, they would have to surgically go into all these departments and say, you can't do DEI. If you do it, you will lose your job, and essentially scrape it out of all the institutions. Once it's scraped out, I don't think it's coming back in. I actually don't think even if the Democrats got in 2028, that they would suddenly roll DEI out the same way it was. I just think it's lost its prestige in a way that means that it won't be easy to just put it back in. But it still needs to be surgically removed because it won't just go on its own. There are too many people with an interest in perpetuating the system and the institutions. And therefore, I think it is also going to take political parties that take these issues seriously and act on them in order to change the texture of our institutional life. Yeah.
I completely agree. And that's something that I think about a lot, is these entrenched ideas where the battle may have been lost or won by one side, yet they're kind of there hiding under the floorboards, and you need to rip them up with a hammer and actually surgically remove them. And everyone's going to agree with you. They're not going to resist, like you say.
Right.
But that action still needs to be taken. And that's why I'm grateful to have you on the podcast, and that Gen Z are moving in this direction of actually speaking about these issues, even if at the same time we're skeptical of free speech and we're trying to suppress people from coming to our campuses. I do think there is this emergence of media where people are openly actually discussing ideas, engaging in this battle of ideas, where you can root out these issues, go past the slogans that are sort of keeping them at bay, and surgically remove them. So I appreciate the conversation today. It's blown my brain in quite a few different ways. I have to reflect on that. Where can people find more of your work?
Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, that's very, very kind of you. Yeah, you can find me in several places. I mean, my Twitter, or X, is just at EPKAUFM. I have my website, www.snapseps.net. You can also look up my book, which is entitled Taboo in Britain and the Third Awakening in North America. And also, I suppose you can look at the Center for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham, and I've got a website there. Please do check it out. Elliot, it's been a pleasure.
And heading over to Substack, where Eric's going to answer some of your questions.